Welcome everybody to the Community Technology Advisory Council Fireside Chat. Today we have Dan McIntosh with us. He's the director of the Wyoming Center for the Business and Economic Analysis piece at the Laramie County Community College. He's one of the most trusted voices in the state when it comes to understanding our labor market, our housing challenges, and how Wyoming can find a potential growth. But before we get started, we'll just do a quick introduction for all of us, and I'll go ahead and start with you, Matt.
Yeah, Matt Fields. I work in the AI and tech sector here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and also work with 4-H for STEM and robotics.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Russ. I am a local computer teacher.
Hi, I'm Michael Rudolph. I'm a former aerospace systems engineer.
And I'm Summer Watson. I work at the NCAR Wyoming Supercomputing Center. And I want to go ahead and welcome Dan. Dan, if you just want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Dan McIntosh. I am a lifelong resident of this beautiful city and Laramie County, and I am currently serving as the director for the Wyoming Center for Business and Economic Analysis, as well as a instructor of economic and policy issues at the Laramie County Community College. And today I'm going to talk about the annual trends report that was published in March, covering data from 2025, as well as cover ongoing issues that we're noticing both globally and then regionally, and of course, central to Laramie County. Right, well, I'm going to share with everybody today a revised annual trends report that was published by the Wyoming Center for Business and Economic Analysis. My name is Dan McIntosh, and of course I'm referring to the revision being the recent geopolitical shifts that we've all been keeping an eye on. Certainly changes how we think about oil production and a lot of the revenue sources and spending in our state. So yeah, I've sort of combined it with a way of thinking about any kind of strategic advantage. And so some of the terms I'm using are in light of that. So the best way to think of it is that we're operationally sound, but we have limited surge capacity. I put a little thing there for you. All right. So if I were, manning the systems here, I'd be looking at revenue for our state looking strong, and this was looking strong even before oil prices jumped up and some of the other factors I bring in. Employment is very strong, and I'm going to get into a little bit how that might be too strong. Commercial investment, as we've seen, especially in Laramie County, is healthy. But there's also some hidden tail risk there. And then at the point of publishing this, energy production, housing costs, and limited labor slack were all trending in the wrong direction. Obviously, energy production is likely to behave differently. So what's going on here? I think I just lost my connection. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, we lost you there for a minute.
So what I'm saying here on the taxable sales section is the 3.56 billion that we brought in taxable sales is a new high, even adjusted for seasonal inflation. A lot of that was driven by increase in sales. Yep.
Could you actually jump back about 30 seconds? We actually lost you for a bit longer than that.
Oh, sorry. Yep. I was just tying up this slide here where a lot of the terms that I'm going to be using relate to how we sort of manage our strategic assets up in space. So when we're thinking about satellites, and I've done that just to kind of give framing around direction, sort of a vector, if you will, towards what we're wanting to see in an economy. So I started with operationally sound with limited surge capacity. So if we're trying to think about how we'd want to build our economy as like the most robust and safe sort of chassis, we're in a good position, but we need to figure out a way to manage this up at scale. So on that note, that's where I came in on this part, where if you're looking at your sort of green to red warning indicators, revenue is very strong, employment is very strong, commercial investment is still doing well, with much more potential there. But we were looking at some yellowing to red signals in the energy production and housing cost side. Of course, energy production has since shifted, which brought us to this one. So at the point of publication in March, oil production was down significantly, and our new spuds is basically when we were going to look to expand operations had hit zero, which in all of the data that I looked at over the past 35 years of the center collecting this information, there had never been a year of zero. So that was quite frightening, especially since we derive so much of our revenue in the state from oil production. And then, of course, everything changed literally 24 hours after publishing this report. So I have struck out those as warning indicators. And just to kind of give some context, when I published this, oil was around $65 a barrel. Today it's trading at 98. So we are looking at a possible 12-month range of 70 on the low side up to 110. Again, all depending on whether this intervention continues occurring in the Middle East right now. So the taxable sales graph there on the bottom right gives a pretty good account of the trend that we're seeing. We did see a dip in 2024, but 2025 largely driven by sales tax pulled from our data centers. So each time that they're purchasing things, now there are exemptions that they benefit from, but we're still able to collect quite a bit of those sales. And just generally consumer confidence and consumer behavior in Laramie County is up. I don't have it in this report, in this presentation, but in the main report, we're also seeing an association with higher new car purchases and auto title registrations. So people are happy to be spending money right now. I think, again, some of that is probably because we have a very tight labor market and people are likely being compensated and turning those increased compensations into increased purchases and consumer behavior. You could also maybe make the case that the decrease in property taxes that we've experienced in the last year or two could have translated to increased sales tax. I don't have a straight answer on that. There's been a lot of different variables that have led into this, but the fact is that it's driving new sales and more sales in across all sectors. And yeah, that's generally healthy for our county.
Okay, real quick. If you go back to that previous slide, the oil production right now, we were kind of wanted to jump into that one. So in Wyoming, what point does production typically start to kick back in?
And that's the hard part. So I'll show the next slide. Kind of gives it a little bit more granularity to that. So you can see our production really has kind of stayed in this like $10 million range. It's somewhat loosely correlated. The problem, though, it really doesn't make sense if you're looking annually. I think oil being so volatile, to truly understand how things move, you have to go to like the quarterly basis. So if we see an annual price of, take COVID, for example, in 2020, where it dropped as low as $39 a barrel. And I'm sure most of us will remember that there was even a period during that year where you were actually making money. Can't remember how it was working, but there were firms in the Permian Basin that were having to pay others to take their oil because they had more supply than they could sell. And so they were actually losing money because they couldn't even sell it at the bottom basement prices. So, that type of fluctuation, you would expect, well, okay, surely our production would have fallen to zero because nobody wants to produce something that they're having to pay other people to buy. But we just don't have that level of sensitivity. It's there's like I said earlier, there's about that 2-quarter lag that I found. And there's also other things. So that correlation that I found was only about 0.5, 0.6. So there's also other things that I'm sure these firms are having to take under consideration. But to answer your question, the best I could say, I think that range, if I could put it at like an annual, is probably around where we were below. So 70 would make sense. Quarterly, I think that range has a little bit more of a window where I'd put the low side around 65. It feels like we really start tightening production around there. And then, anything that signals not just, 65 to 70, but it's the delta that really seems to move the needle. So if the expectation is 65 to 66, we're not going to see much of that sensitivity. But if there's a significant jump like what we saw in 2022, that's where the production really cranks up. And again, that's somewhat captured in that annual data there. You see 2022, we were around 8 million. And then by 2023, we were in 9.1. But looking at that at the quarterly level, all of that was captured in Q1, Q2.
Okay. So long term, if the current influencers, from the Middle East conflict right now continue, how might that benefit Wyoming's economy in the short term?
Yeah. And I'll answer Summer's question real quick as well. So spuds is imagine like a pure green field where there is no oil production. There's never been oil production. There's no permitting. A spud allows the producer to go into that area and say, I want to start. It's effectively like a building permit for your drilling operations. So it's a leading indicator on the optimism for the production side of oil. If we see 1 or 2, some years we've seen double digits like 10, 15, that's a very healthy sign, indication that oil companies are looking ahead forward for years and years, thinking that this will be a viable option for them. When it got below double digits and we were into like the 5s and 6s, that felt more like they were just sort of operationally ticking along. Like you could sort of imagine that maybe they're going to retire one well and they're going to bring another one online, but there's certainly no understanding of expansion. But when we got to 0 or like 2 or 3, that is a straight contractionary type of response to lower prices. And then, of course, the other thing that they have to consider is they were just coming out of the Biden era administration with respect to regulations and all these other things. And so, while there's probably a lot more excitement around the current administration, and there's still that sort of hesitancy, which is this could all change in 3 years, 2 years. And if it takes us that much long to just get that permit process through, we're not able to extract within that period. Maybe this will all be for nothing. And that's where, like this, again, looking at spuds is a good sort of barometer, early warning of what we can anticipate in the next 12, 18, 24 months. If that makes sense.
Okay.
And sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question as well, but Matt, you can go first. Okay.
Just curious as to what we might see as a short-term economic impact, or if the existing conflict continues, and Wyoming meets that 2-quarter period, there might be some short-term boom benefit in Wyoming while also offsetting a higher cost of fuel and other products within that same time period. What does that look like? Is it basically a match for higher cost of oil, higher cost of products, and then also Wyoming's labor and everything else coming up?
Yeah, I think all of that is related. I think the hard part right now is we have no crystal ball into how sustained these prices will be. If this is sort of, as Chairman Powell was talking about the other day, we're again in this sort of transitory period where he's not worried about inflation. He's not worried about sticky prices. They're all kind of anticipating, and again, that's where I try to look at like the 12-month forecast for oil prices. And I've been watching those actually more closely than I've been looking at the spot price, because spot price is very sensitive to any geopolitical headwind, but the 12-month tends to be a little more cautious. And so that took probably a week before it started to budge. Now we are seeing those upper ranges start to show up. So, depending where you look at, EIA has it at around 110, but I'm seeing also forecasts that put it right back down to 70. If we continue to see, again, like probably into the next quarter, into Q2, even Q3, then I think you can confidently expect stronger price pressures. And so inflationary battles with sort of at the macro level, but then also just locally, we tend to feel inflation very quickly when our boom cycles hit with natural resources. And on that note, this is probably one of the scarier headwinds that we have. Oftentimes when we see unemployment numbers, we like to think lower is better. And for the most part, that's true. Anything around 4% is good. If it gets up to 5%, right, that's like worse than 4. But when you're around 3%, which we thankfully actually went up a little bit, but for the Q2, Q3, and Q4 of 2025, we were stubbornly around 2.9% and 3%, which provides no slack in our labor market. And that means that if you're a company wanting to expand, you're an entrepreneur wanting to develop, you're wanting to do anything that's going to require some surplus labor, you're either going to have to pay significantly more to bring it in, or what we've seen here is that you typically have to sort of pay a premium on your commuters. And that's really where that bottom graph tells a sort of different story in terms of our labor market in Laramie County, which is that while we have around 9,000 that commute out, we have about 10,000 that commute in. And while net, that's about the same, 1,000 difference. The important thing to look at is what type of earnings the outcoming and incoming commuters are generating, and there's a significant delta between those two. So people who live elsewhere but work in Laramie County are generating significantly more earnings for themselves and taking those back with them to their counties than those who live here and work outside. Again, we benefit from that somewhat because those jobs wouldn't be available at all, which means the companies that employ those people wouldn't be able to operate without that commuter workforce. But it also means that we're losing a lot of revenue from them staying here and seeing movies and going to restaurants and doing all the things that one would do if they lived in the community that they worked. And that change has been significant, going back to when I was in high school, and it's only grown year over year since then. Okay. So yeah, 259 million in earnings, and that was annually, so that's not total. So again, each one of those slivers you can see in that bottom right there, that's another 250. So we're talking billions of dollars that we have in deficit to our earnings due to outgoing workforce.
Wow.
Okay.
And,
Go ahead, Caitlin. Go ahead.
oh, I just had a question around employees. I was wondering, Dan, if there's any data around the type of employees or the type of skills that are needed in Laramie County.
Yeah, and I've tried my best because that question comes up a lot when I present on this. I've talked with CRMC. I've talked with a couple of the tech industries, of course, about this. And I've also just driven around town, right? That you can kind of do a anecdotal capture of just looking at the license plates in different parking lots, and that kind of tells a story as well. So I think based on the incomes and the difference, I think we can confidently say that these are going to be higher skilled, higher paying jobs. So, if you look at education requirements of certain roles and how that's oftentimes associated with higher incomes, or if you're just looking at something as like particular sectors, and I'll get into that in a couple slides here, and just looking at the growth, well, we know for a fact our labor force has been stagnant in Laramie County for years. In fact, it's dropped a little bit in 2025, but our overall employment has increased. So if you're seeing the increases in certain sectors, but our domestic labor force hasn't increased, then you can attribute that growth to increased commuter numbers, right? So again, that's a loose approximation. I certainly want to, bet my house on that, but there's enough sort of story there, I think, that you can start kind of making that decision. What were you gonna say, Matt?
As I say, so you have this group of people that are basically commuting into Laramie County, basically working jobs, and they leave again, and they take that income back somewhere else. So I've heard of things of housing crunch, things like daycare and other things. How much are those actually impacting that group that is leaving? And are there other things that are impacting it that Wyoming or Laramie County doesn't have that we really need to look at developing and having within the area?
Yeah, 100%. And this is actually one of the topics that I would kind of put to the group to discover more about, because again, I try to capture this in just conversations around the community. I'll use CRMC again on this, which is or I'd even use the college, right? There's several of my coworkers do live outside of the county and then drive in. And so, I asked them, why? Like, what is it quality of life? Is it, having that third space? Is it daycare? All these things. And oftentimes what it comes down to is that affordability, is that housing piece. Thankfully, I haven't heard anything about schools. I think that might be an area in the future, and that, like, if we're closing schools down, it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But most of the time, what it comes back to is either their partner has a higher paying job wherever they are, and so they sort of prioritize one of the household's preferences for convenience, I suppose. And then the other part of it, which is I mean, quite frankly, they said, well, it's just easier, right? They said, I don't mind it. It's a 45-minute commute. And I kind of get that. Obviously, if you've been through a true Wyoming winter, though, I don't know if there's anything easy about driving 45 minutes from Fort Collins in a snowstorm, but perhaps there's enough flexibility for them that they maybe don't do that. I would anticipate we see this continue to grow. And again, you can kind of see from that graph where we've seen significant jumps. It is that frictionless dynamic that allows people to do that. And so I think there's a bit more barrier for them to commute. I know Denver puts a head tax, like a poll tax, more or less, on people who live outside of metro area but work there. So their employers have to pay an additional $5 a month for them. I don't think that's enough of a friction point for someone who's like living in an affordable house in the suburbs to, try to force themselves to live inside of the Denver metro area. But, these are things that have been discussed. It just, if it's easier, then people will not think twice about it. Whereas again, 20 years ago, there were people who commuted, but you're spending a lot of money on gas. You're spending a lot of money.
Dan, we lost you right as you were saying we spend a lot of money on gas.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just sort of tying in these different ideas of if you were strongly motivated to live in Colorado, and I'm picking on Colorado only because they represent about 25 to 30% of those commuters. The other group is Albany County, and some of the even Natrona County sends people down. So I think had about 20%. Larimer had about 20%. So maybe it's closer to 40%. And then everyone else is commuting from other counties in Wyoming. But yeah, if you were trying to make this work before you had capacity, and you were either at the office or you weren't, and again, culturally we've also been more accepting to this. A lot of that probably ties in. So I don't anticipate us ever getting back those people who've just decided to make life for themselves someplace else, unless we either significantly lower the housing prices so that we once again have a significant difference in how the cost of living in Wyoming, particularly in Laramie County, or we again offer some other value that Fort Collins just can't provide, which I don't know what that would be aside from tax.
Well, I do know that we've got a ton of housing being built right now, high density housing especially. We have got a bunch of new developments also coming in, but those things usually take 2 to 4 years to really come and take effect in the market. So I guess we'll probably see those in the next year, really what that does for that market, if that changes any of those numbers at all. Do you think that's actually key for people coming to Wyoming? We just can't find housing.
Yeah, it's definitely part of it. There's only one way to really know is that if we ever were to hit that surplus number. So as great as it is to see all the housing that's showing up in terms of meeting that demand, try to find so like we're still running a significant deficit with even if we count the projects that are underway now as being completed, we're still in around 200 or so of unmet demand, which means that it's unlikely that we're going to see housing prices relax at all. So these are the current figures, 8% nearly increase in the county, 3%, and this is 3% on top of the already 10% double digit type of increases. So we spiked and we have not slowed down, and until we actually get to that surplus point where we start seeing prices drop, I just don't see us becoming that affordable option, even with the increased construction. And unfortunately, as though it might feel as though we're seeing these new developments, based on historical data, we're still below where we should have been. And I think a lot of that, again, talking with Ryman, some of the construction companies around town, is that they're pinched because they're having a hard time finding the labor. They're having a hard time finding the people who are able to swing the hammers and put up the walls to do the work to build these. And there's other complaints as well around regulation and removing some of those barriers, but they're just not as motivated as they were 20 years ago to take out 300 permits in a year, 400, 500. We were up to 600 in some years, as you can see here on this historical trend. And oftentimes we would see a good mix. So you'd see obviously a lot of single family. That's where the money is for these companies. Occasionally a big project would show up. That's where you have the multifamily in 2022 there, but you'd still see enough dispersion where you'd have your apartments, you'd have your triplex, you'd have your duplexes, and for a while there we got overly concentrated in one area, which again puts a lot of pressure on that one area, because now all of a sudden there is no alternative for that multifamily. So everyone's crowding in to buy those $250,000 homes. That then puts pressure on those to become the new $300,000 home. And then that puts pressure on the $350,000 home to become the $400,000 home. And I think that's how you see prices get up to, I can't even say it, like $400,000 to live in Cheyenne. But
yeah,
my 80-year-old father just cannot handle it.
So the pricing of houses and stuff like that right now that we're seeing, is that a direct correlation to the inflation that we've seen over the last few years? And typically when you have inflation, rapid inflation, you also have an issue where wages are the last thing to catch up. Is that kind of what we're seeing right now? Is we saw the housing market really explode. because of the inflation change, things, people start buying. The, we had very low interest rates. People bought into things that they maybe couldn't afford. Now we're into a situation where we got a lot of housing out there. Demand's high also, and wages are just now starting to catch up. So it's just kind of a push me, pull you.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And inflation at all times is just simply a matter of too much money chasing too few goods. And so if you can't increase production for numerous reasons, and again, it becomes this sort of downward cycle where you're not able to build new homes because the cost of labor is so high, then all of a sudden you have higher prices for homes, which you would hope that unlocks, the supply side. But if that's not happening, then in the short term, we all just pay $400,000 for homes. And until that can get unlocked, and some firms, and the other thing that's interesting that I hadn't considered in a while, but I was talking to a colleague of mine at Boulder, and he was saying when he drives through Wyoming, what surprises him so much is that he doesn't see the Lanairs or the KBs or like the large housing operations that you see all over Colorado. And his suspicion was that they've tried to pencil it out and they can't make it work for them. If one of those firms were to show up though and build those sort of larger projects, I think that would be, as again, depending on your opinions of whether you like those quality of homes or not, but that would sort of be the silver bullet that would benefit this community. But it would take that level of operation to show up and do it, because as much as Ed Ernst and some of the local developers are able to put together 6 or 7 homes in a year, or if they're being really aggressive, maybe 10, 12. They're not doing the 40 unit plan development projects that you see all over Colorado Springs. And again, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but that would be the only way that you're able to capture and meet the demand that's currently being unmet and unmet for the last 10 years, 15 years.
Dan, what can the government do in this case? Is there infrastructure? Is there new industry? Like how can policy affect this?
Lots of ways. I think at the federal level, they're doing some interesting things with the I can't remember what it eventually got named. It existed in the House for a while, and then there was a counter bill in the Senate, and it eventually came out where they relaxed the rules in terms of unit requirements. So there's like 2 types of requirements when you build. There's the structural requirements, and oftentimes that's federally regulated, and then there's like the zoning requirements that the municipal, the county, or the state has in terms of what you build. And the federal regulations have, I don't know if you guys have gotten a chance to read Ezra Klein's Abundance book, or Carr's book on Cass, Orrin Cass's book. But both of them kind of point to that same direction, which is we've sort of overshot the landing on regulatory requirements for building in this country. And so by relaxing that, it gives a lot more optionality to homeowners and developers as well to be able to, one of the examples is you're now able to take advantage of like pre-built homes. So think sort of like manufactured homes and like a trailer, if you will, but don't think that, right? We're not talking double wides that you see on the south side of town. We're talking homes that have been built really, really well. And
Dan, we lost you again. We lost you at trailer homes on the south side, and then
oh yeah, okay. So with those types of regulatory relaxations in rural areas of the country where land is relatively affordable, the only costs that are really being encountered, and this goes to the like that partnership between federal relaxing the rules and then local municipalities and state governments stepping up to try to figure out how to lower the transaction costs of plating or sending out your plumbing or your electrical or whatever the infrastructure out to that area is. Because then what will happen is, consumers can purchase these homes at a significant discount and have a great home on a site that they can get funding for and they can get financing for, and then start building equity. I had a conversation with Dan Dorsch, who's the director for Habitat for Humanity in town as well. And Summer, you heard the conversation recently as well on that. But I was blown away at like the cost that they have to encumber. And in fact, one of the deals that they had, Antelope Ridge, was only made possible because they had sort of a nonprofit mentality to it, but they were able to make the project work where a private company just wouldn't be able to. And I think that's the type of thing where as a local government, you really have to be sensitive to that type of barrier. And I don't think anyone's intentionally doing that. I hope not anyway. But if they can relax that, then these federal regulations that have been adjusted are going to make affordability in terms of the building of a home so much better. I think about like what's happening right now outside of Austin. I was in Barstow not too long ago, and that's a perfect example. Is like you go into these communities and they're just bringing these beautiful homes on the back of semis. And they're able to, manufacture almost everything that you need for the home off-site at scale, really well done, factory level quality work, and then they just assemble it on site. And you couldn't tell the difference between that home and a home that was built, at the site by hand for the 12 months or whatever that would require for that. And they're doing really interesting things in that direction. So again, that could be an option that we could look at in Laramie County and across Wyoming, since land is available. We just have to figure out a way to make it affordable to put something on top of it.
Yeah. So if we were to get more houses in sufficient to meet demand plus excess, would that bring in more jobs?
I think so. I think it would sort of be this virtuous cycle on the other direction, right? We could potentially reverse the course where all of a sudden it makes sense for you to live in Laramie County, but then work in Fort Collins. And that goes back to that affordability piece, because that was the story when I was growing up. So, in that graph, I'm old enough now where now I'm on the far end of the graph. And most of the people that I knew who had jobs in tech, they worked at HP. There were no tech jobs sort of that level in here. And so they would live in Cheyenne and then drive down to Fort Collins and work at the HP, or some people would drive down to IBM to Boulder. And they did strictly because it was so much more affordable. And, everything from, kids be able to play like all the different sports and be able to get anywhere in town by, driving 5 minutes. These are really attractive things for people, to consider. And for a while, it felt like Cheyenne had a monopoly of that in the region. Perhaps we still have some advantage into that. I think public schools here are still doing pretty well, punching above their weight. And I have a slide on that, but it's that housing piece that has just gotten completely out of control in the last 10 years that, again, I think scares people. If you're living in a $700,000 home in Fort Collins, and you're thinking about trading up, you used to be able to, buy that $750,000 home and get 40 acres of land here. Now you're getting like just basically what you had in Fort Collins.
Yeah,
I have a question. Oh, sorry, Matt. I have a question, Dan, about the housing. If there was, and I know this is hypothetical, but if they built houses to the point that we didn't have this deficit, would you also then see an increase in the businesses and services that were offered to these new people?
Yeah, there's often a tipping point. I've looked at this mostly from like a macro level, but like you need like 2 or 3 things in order to see increased filing of patents and increased filing of businesses. And there's sort of this like perfect storm, but one of those main things is public access to education, which again, I think that's sort of a foregone, thing in Wyoming. Thankfully, hopefully that remains so. But then the other part is, affordability of housing and services. And so typically one follows the other, and there are exceptions. Of course, you think about like Silicon Valley and certain areas that tend to get a lot of the attention, but those are anomalous. In order to just make it work, if you think about how Walmart decides to go into an area, right? they basically look to see what median income is, the number of homes that they could service, and once they show up, what happens? Every Walmart that you've ever driven by has 12 or 15 other, sort of add-on shops and businesses and everything that go along with it, because they're using the same model that Walmart does. And they basically say as a proxy, well, if we have a Walmart, then we also have a Long John Silver and an Applebee's or whatever the other things are. And it's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. And they're just looking at the same thing. And so, growth begets more growth. And that growth is only enabled by housing. There's no, like, Walmart doesn't look at, just income or just, schools or something like that. That housing piece is weighted very, very heavily in terms of their decision to move into an area, as it would be with like Home Depot or any of those other large box type of stores that, they're going to be spending $20 million on their infrastructure build out. Very different sort of analysis work than say just a mom and pop wanting to franchise a Pizza Hut. If that makes sense.
I think something else that's interesting is, and I think a bit of this is, if you build more housing, it runs into an engineering problem where if you build it, they will come. I think you can do that to a certain point, but at some point, all you're going to do is essentially take the existing population and distribute it more evenly over that new area. And at some point, you're going to reach a threshold where you're not expanding anymore, and now you're sitting on excess. But you did touch on a point I think that's really important. You said that families need schools, but they also need things that go around the schools. They need things that get their kids into stuff. They need activities. They need restaurants. You need all of these other ancillary services, and that's what really starts to make something attractive to employees or people that want to work in the workforce in that area. But you also, at the same time, you can't attract, let's say, someone like, I guess you could say HP into this area unless you have a workforce. Otherwise, they're going to be trying to sell someone somewhere else to come move to Wyoming to sit here to reap these benefits. So it has to be, you have to have a workforce. Then you have to have an area that can support that workforce, the existing workforce, and they're sufficient there and of a certain level of knowledge and capacity to be able to support these companies' needs. And then that company can look at the benefits of moving into like Wyoming, business benefits, tax benefits, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it's just, like you said, it's the perfect storm of all these things have to come together. If you don't have that, then you're ultimately sitting there waiting for one or the other. And I think that we hear that in the news a lot, where we need more housing that will support this, that'll develop it. We don't see if we are going to be targeting this area, this sector of business and bringing them in, what do we need in all these different groups to get them to that point? How do we need to develop it? What's the macro plan long term? And I think that we go through and look at all this data, and it really is showing us, yes, we see the effects of what's happening, contracting, expanding, things like that, which is Wyoming's economy, right? Boom and bust a lot. But we don't see the macro way of how we're going to get from where we're at right now to a much more stabilized economy. And this data is great, but we do see that contraction and expansion all over again. Looking at the oil prices, looking at the growth rates, looking at all of that. So I guess the question I would ask is, as we're going through this and looking more into it, what is Wyoming's greatest weakness? What is the top level item or items that are really, that's keeping Wyoming from being, what Fort Collins is in terms of economic growth?
I'm sorry, could you ask that question one more time?
Yeah, I can. What's keeping Wyoming from benefiting from economic growth, like places like Fort Collins or Denver? What's the difference between the two of us? Obviously, we don't have the services, we don't have entertainment, arts, things like that would be beneficial, which means we don't attract the higher quality of different businesses that would operate here, some of the different like restaurants and things like that. So what's the top one or two items that would really drive that change within Wyoming, and what's not driving it right now?
I mean, this is the $1 billion question, right? This is the question we've all been asking ourselves for as long as I've lived here. And I read Friedenthal's book, The Paradox of Plenty, and he gives an account of this going all the way back to basically once Wyoming became Wyoming, they started asking that question, right? Which is, where'd everyone go, right? Helen Will showed up, we built the railway, and then they all left again, and we've tried to figure that out. One of the things that I don't know if it was mentioned in here, or I can't remember where I heard this, but I've thought a lot about it, which is no one's going to invest in you until you invest in yourself. And that is a very distinct feel when you go into a community like Fort Collins or Boulder, some of these areas along the Front Range, and it's clear, beautiful rec centers, beautiful greenways, beautiful like main sort of public areas and spaces. That's not the vibe. You drive off of I-25 or off of I-80 and you're driving, across the viaduct or through downtown. Unless you just happen to time it right on a First Friday event, you're not going to get the feeling that, Wyoming invests in itself. And I'd certainly be the last one to make the claim that, we have to see more government spending and all these other things to make it happen. However, I don't think not spending is also the answer. I think spending in ways that make sense to sort of signal that we are open for business and we're open for families. I think that's huge. And again, I think that was kind of what a lot of the pushback on Josh and the team at WBC and a lot of the work that, they've been trying to do, because it's not terribly visible, especially for those of us who aren't, really close to that environment. It either A, looks like they're spending money in the wrong areas and they're not spending it well, or B, it's that they're not spending it in the ways that we see, that we all benefit from. And so we have potholes and we have blight in our downtown, and we have areas like the hole, right, the classic hole next to the Heinz building. If you're a serious company and you're wanting to invest and you go to the downtown and you're seeing shuttered shops and a giant hole in the center, I mean, are you really going to be motivated to call this home? And I again, you need that inertia, right? You need a little bit to get things going, and then eventually you see more of it. And what's weird is that this is distinctly Laramie County, because I spent some time in Casper not too long ago, and Casper has a beautiful downtown, and they have that new kind of outdoor area that's there. Gillette has always been ahead of the game on this kind of stuff. So if I were, if I were king for the day, right, where I could do anything and, I didn't have to answer to anybody, I don't think I have an answer to you, right? Like my default would probably be to spend money, but again, I think I also know the harms of that. And so I'm very suspicious to be, well, no, we'll just solve the problem by spending money. I don't know.
I think it's twofold, right?
Right.
You want to spend the money, but if you build it, will they come? That's the thing. If you make a massive, beautiful city, we've seen this in China, we've seen this in other places, well, it doesn't actually attract the people in. So you need, a friend of mine, Kent Hughes, his biggest thing was you need both a private and a public partnership to actually make things work, to actually create the growth. Because let's look at the business council, right? The business council is focused in on the businesses. It's going out and talking to businesses, we bring you in, and it brings them in. But then you look at the communities, and quite honestly, the communities have not been invested in. The communities have just kind of languished, to better words. And you need the opposite. You need a private partnership, I think, really to go into the communities and start building the communities up that can then work with the Wyoming Business Council and say, okay, we built the community up. The Business Council can work on the infrastructure, but you need the community itself built up before that infrastructure is needed. And it becomes, it's that perfect storm of, you get the community investing in itself, it's investing in its future workforce, kids, things like that. It's also starting to take pride in itself. That means it starts to create that more nice place, which then brings in your government, which then invests in the sidewalks, the roads, and everything else you need. But then you also need the Wyoming Business Council to invest in water infrastructure, to invest in building out business parks and things, and to come together to create that whole sphere of benefit and help to move things forward. I think that's what we're lacking here is you have a lot of money gets thrown at something, and then it sits there and it wastes away or just doesn't get used because we don't take the pride, or the community doesn't have the pride and the investment in the community to actually help push things forward. That's my opinion.
No, and I think you're onto it, and I'm gonna sort of segue in that idea into Summer's question about how does this infect technology, and after all, that's kind of what we're doing is I've circled the three sectors. So the BEA doesn't break out like IT per se, so you kind of have to use information and other services as a proxy for that. But if you look at the growth and you look at the importance of that diversification of the economy and bringing in these new businesses, and I'm talking about data centers, but I'm not just talking about data centers. You do see an increase in participation that wasn't there before. And if we're talking about the crowding out dimension of government, especially in Laramie County, that's sort of been, our double-edged sword here, in that it provides a little bit of smoothness during the hard times because we have an economy that, gets to rely a little bit on government spending, but it also serves as a bit of a crowding out to private industry that wants to come in. They have to compete with, if nothing else, state salaries and state pensions. So if that wasn't there, they could probably attract more labor here. And being what it is, if government is increasing in size, that's not necessarily an evil, but if government's increasing in size and nothing else is, then all of a sudden we have problems. What we'd like to see, to your point, is both increasing. So we want to see our information technology sector increase alongside government. And that's actually what we're seeing. So, construction obviously leading the way, but that's something that's much more in that boom bust type of dynamic. Construction correlates as that, again, leading indicator of what is to come. That's certainly not something, and you can see the volatility over the years, right? Like we've gone from, sort of 2 years of normal growth and then 2 years of drop and then up again and then down again. And it's very volatile. And that captures wages as well. Whereas information and we'll call like the tech sector tends to be fairly, I wouldn't call it flat, but certainly less volatile. And any type of growth that we do see tends to stick. So if we've gone up a little bit and gone down a little bit outside of COVID, mind you, it tends to trend in a constant direction, which is great because that's a good, healthy sign that, good investment attracts more investment. On that note, however, I will pull up one thing that somewhat looks at this in a different light. So this is just pure annual earned dollars. So what type of area, and this kind of goes back also to that commuting question as well, which is, are we having to pay more for that industry? And the answer is yes, right now we are, which is good if you're in that industry, right? So if you're
Hey, Dan.
Sorry. Yep.
All right. These industries seem fairly consistent in.
Yep. So if we're seeing the increase in wages and you're the employee, then you're feeling pretty good about that because you're seeing your quality of life, your standard of living increase relative to those around you. And in all the happiness studies, like that's what we know actually makes people happy. It's not that you got paid more, it's that you got paid more and the person next to you didn't. It's super cynical, but it's worth bearing out, which is, if you're in the COVID period and you're seeing that your neighbor, used to do this, is now the real estate agent guy and he's making, way more money than anybody else has, you're gonna feel worse about your decisions. And then all of a sudden you get to catch up. And I'm pointing to this because that's the sector that's just above professional and scientific, but all of a sudden we're out ahead on this. And so if you're in the IT field right now, you're feeling pretty good about Laramie County. But if you're trying to employ those people and you're trying to attract more of those people, you're having to pay a lot more to get that labor into your company. And we talk about like the sort of production possibility frontier where in order to grow a sector, in order to continue that return on investment, you're going to have to start pulling people from other sectors and you're going to have to do so at a premium. And we need to be careful about that because again, like I said earlier, we want to see sort of all ships rise, and if we're having to get growth in a certain sector at the cost of another, that should be cause for concern. And I'm all about, people picking different careers in their lives. And, we have this happen all the time at the college where, someone was a trucker and they're like, I want to get off the road, I want to do this, and they come over and they take IT courses. That's awesome. But if we're discouraging high school kids from going into education or going into some other services where healthcare would be another obvious example, because they're seeing Microsoft data centers paying so much more, or like what we saw with Walmart paying $40 an hour for a distribution job. I don't think we need to be cautious about that type of growth. If people are only going into one sector because that just happens to be the one that's paying the most, we're really going to set ourselves up for problems later on. Again, it's not the construction thing. We're not that volatile, but we're certainly not immune from seeing downturns. And anyone who lived through the 2000s or again the 2009s knows exactly that feeling. So right now it feels really good. And to answer your question, Summer, is like, it's a really good sign for technology right now. But I don't think it's something that we can just bank on, because again, these firms are having to pay a lot of money right now in order to continue that growth. And that's not even talking about the, geopolitical headwinds that they're facing for, chips and everything else.
Yeah. I'd add on to that a little bit. One of the things too is, as the state, we do have limited resources. We have so much power capacity. We have so much water. We have so many things that all of these, data centers, and we look at them and like, we're going to continue growing, and we're basically estimating that it's going to continue to scale upwards. Well, we've already hit the limits of where we can scale. And as the market is waiting for those resources to become more available or anything else, we're actually going to see that market probably eventually come to a point where it changes, it innovates differently, does something slightly, and then it contracts slightly, and then you see it more or less even out. And I think we're going to see that with data centers. We've kind of reached capacity there. We can't really continue to add more data centers. We've reached that capacity. So pursuing more data center growth within the state, I think, is going to lead us down the wrong road, where we need to look at how do we diversify. We do have manufacturing in the Gillette area. We've got a lot of financial stuff in the Jackson, Du Bois area. We've got data centers here in Wyoming. We've got oil, gas, mining down in like Rock Springs and stuff. And we need to make sure that we're looking at diversifying, but also working throughout the state to ensure that we are building up the communities, building up the people in those areas, so that as new opportunities come up, we can start to attract those industries that are not volatile. We can attract the things that, you're going to attract companies like the Walmart distribution center or things like that will continue just to operate despite the economy for the most part. And that's what we need more of throughout the state, because then that starts to reduce that up and down, up and down, up and down, which then keeps your services, which then keeps your community developing and moving forward.
Yep, 100%. And it was funny you bring that up, because in class just recently I was talking about the economic of history going back to even pre-territory days, and how, you know, when we pivoted to natural resources and we created that, again, paradox of plenty, that over-reliance on just one sector. And I sort of said cheekily that, you know, well, don't worry about it, guys, because, you know, we have data centers right now. And I said, is anyone nervous about that? And they kind of paused for a moment. And I said, so have you guys heard about this like AI bubble? What do you guys think? And all of a sudden, like, you could see the lights start going off, because they're like, oh, right. So like, if we're also in a bubble and we're calling this diversification, we're piling into this new thing that is also vulnerable to booms and busts. Are we really better off to quote diversify? And so you hit it perfectly, which is, okay, we don't want to discourage that necessarily, but that is not the savior, right? Saying that we're going to diversify off of natural resources by going all in something else that is also vulnerable to boom and bust cycles feels like the wrong strategy. So hopefully, hopefully we take that a bit mindful. You also brought up Teton County, which I always like to throw this part in here. So the dotted line there, that's Wyoming's median household income. Going back to, I started when I was born, kind of the world that I know, which is to say that we've been more or less flat. You know, we've never been at the bottom of the barrel nationally, but we've never really grown much. Different areas have seen different growth. We have spikes, we have drops. Our economy as a state, though, is one of redistribution. You know, if you live in a community, you feel the boom and bust, but as a state, we tend to just reshuffle cards every so often. Laramie County remains somewhat, again, immune to that because of the number of state and federal employment options here. But by and large, we just sort of reshuffle cards every so often. What happened after the 2009 recession, and that's what that gray area there is, and arguably depression would be a more accurate depiction, but we see this divergence between Wyoming as a state, Laramie County, and then Teton County. And that spike that looks like the Grand Tetons, you know, creeping up into a peak there, is a perfect example of that. Is that we have seen incredible growth in Teton County from those returns to wealth. Both people migrating there and bringing that wealth with them, but then also just, you know, people who own homes there, oftentimes second homes, that are using that as some sort of tax haven. They've seen increases to that wealth significantly over the last, you know, 12, 15-year bull market that we've all sort of stood by and watched. Laramie County has seen also an increase, but, you know, certainly nowhere near on par with Teton County. And that level of inequality, obviously something that they're having to reconcile with there specifically, but it also, I think, conceals a potentially more troubling reality about Wyoming's economy. Is if I were to pull Teton County out of the data, that dotted line actually has a negative trajectory, because that spike there has been pulling Wyoming's economy broadly up every year since around 2014. When we remove that data point, the state flattens and even decreases a little bit. So I'm not going to be so bold as to say that we're in a somewhat recessionary period or even a depressionary period, but Wyoming as a whole has not grown at all in the last 15 years. If we don't count Teton County. So
okay.
back to our conversation about everything is like, well, what does this all mean? Well, it means that we have to figure something out, because not growing is not really an option, if we're being honest.
Yeah. Okay. So what's our greatest asset within the state itself? What's something that we can grow with?
If you talk about if you talk to Governor Gordon, he'd tell you it's our people, right?
Hey Dan, we heard about
apparently
if you talk to Governor Gordon. Yeah, it seems like there's a timing thing where you get dropped.
Yeah. Well, and apparently broadband is not our greatest asset. I thought it was, so we needed to fix that. But looking at this graph, I took this to Dr. Schaefer, and he obviously watches this much closer than I do. But in order for LCCC to continue growing back to our pre-COVID levels, to the peaks that we had in the 2010, 2011 area, we're going to have to continue relying on outside, attracting outside students and outside populations to come in, because we can't rely on our graduating classes anymore. Enrollment numbers are starting to decrease in high schools. Early indicators that they could rebound for sure, but I talked to Dr. Newton recently, and he said as much as well, which is we're seeing less students. And also, again, this is a pretty easy early indicator, which is what are kindergarten enrollments looking like, right? Kindergarten, first, second, that should give you some example or idea of what's going to happen in 10 years or whatever when they get to high school. And those numbers are not trending in the direction that suggests that we're going to grow our younger populations. And at that same time, if you see the table there above that chart, we're seeing significant increases in the 65 and over population demographics and a decrease in the prime wage earning demographics. So that creates a lot of pressure on those of us who are working to sort of provide, services and tax revenues and all these other things for the folks who are either aging up, just naturally going from the 55 to 65 group, or what we're also seeing is a lot of immigrant of folks who are moving from other parts of the country who are wanting to take their fixed income and stretch it a little bit further in a state that has lower property tax, lower income tax, just generally lower cost of living, but they're not participating in the labor market, and they're not, I don't want to say they're not productive, but in an economic sense, they're not contributing to the economy in a way that a 25 to 35-year-old would. So, as much as I'd love to say where our greatest assets are our people, well, that may be true, but if we can't retain them and we can't employ them from 18, 19 and continue growing that, then we're missing out on that asset.
Got it. Okay. I think we're kind of out of time here, Dan. Thank you. This has really been great. Did have one question. If you could sit down with Governor Gordon, legislators, local community representatives, what are one or two things that you would talk to them about what we can do to get moving in the right direction, that they can make changes to, or that they could add, or things that barriers they could remove to help build something that's better and boost the economy?
I mean, yeah, the biggest thing, and I think this is just front of mind just because the last class that I taught on the economic history of Wyoming, and we need to remember that our founders and the sort of the brilliant people that wrote our Constitution really valued and prioritized education, and the state has done its best when we remember that, and we've done poorly when we forgot that. And so when things are doing well and we have lots of employment in oil and gas and those sectors, and it doesn't make sense to even stay around in high school because you can go out to the oil fields and get your job. I think we sometimes lose sight of that, and that was the reality when I was in high school, is that I had a lot of my peers who were really quick to jump out to the oil rigs and take advantage of that. And I think that for them at that point made all the sense in the world. And I certainly don't want to discourage anybody from doing that. That's the beauty of a free market. But as a state, if we stop investing in our public education and we stop giving the next generation the opportunity that we had, I think we're doing a massive disservice to the future of Wyoming. And it's also a massive disservice to the spirit of the state and what our forebears and forefathers had wanted this state to be and become. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put in an Article 7 into our Constitution. And so, yeah, we need to make sure that we fund education, both K-12, but also higher education, and not lose sight of what makes Wyoming so special.
Yeah, I think you cut the education, you make it less of a priority, you basically damage the workforce of the future. And you only see that as time goes on, you begin to see the effects of that. And unfortunately, sometimes you can reach a point where you damage it enough that it actually causes massive degradation. I think that's what we're seeing. Whether it's funding for it or it's the programs that are available within it, I think that's what we're seeing right now. So I would agree with Governor Gordon. Our greatest asset is our people, and if we don't take care of our people, that starts with their education, then we as a state are losing our way.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for speaking up for public education. It's so important. I'm slightly biased, but
yeah, I know. I feel that way too. I was like, yeah, okay. Let me take off my LCCC instructor hat and I'll put on my economist hat. But like, I can't. All right, I'm still that guy. But I'm also the son of a teacher, so
It's so true, though. I mean, these are our future Wyomingites who are going to be part of our workforce. We want to educate them. We want them to have the best opportunities for growth. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, sorry for the internet connectivity issues today. The irony doesn't escape me. But hopefully.